Nowadays, NASCAR sees a staggering 6 road course races on the schedule, varying from natural road courses, a zomboid one called the Roval, and the first ever street course cup race that will happen this year. But before there was any of these events, there was Riverside. Nowadays, NASCAR fiends for a track close to Hollywood. The thirst for such an event has driven them to build a temporary track every year in a football stadium at the cost of millions. Riverside International Raceway, though, was the best thing to scratch that Tinseltown itch. Being located only 50 miles from Los Angeles, the over 3-mile road course was a state-of-the-art facility for its time. The track was built in 1957, designed by architect William Duquette. Duquette at the time was a 31-year-old aspiring designer. For his architectural work, he was a part of the 101st Airborne during the infamous Battle of the Bulge. He was also a large part of the 705 Tank Destroyer Battalion, working under the guidance of General George S. Patton. He liberated the Mauthausen concentration camp and got his education from UC Berkeley. Much of his work pertained to the housing and development of the subdivision design, one that became iconic with family cottages in the 1950s and 60s. He was presented with a massive project, however. West Coast Automotive Testing Corp were looking at building a racetrack. The head of the company was retired driver Rudy Clay. Clay had built a reputation of racing in Europe and wanted to expand his burgeoning motorsports empire in SoCal. With a budget of $625,000, equivalent to nearly $5.7 million today, Duquette was tasked with designing the track. He struggled to properly instill his imagination, though, due to the perpetual risk of lost budget. Clay was struggling with financing the raceway, and local businessman John Edgar swept in late to help push it over the line. September 1957 would be the first weekend of racing, which saw John Lawrence get killed in a terrible crash in turns 5 and 6. The track had no barriers, which more than likely contributed to his crash. The high speeds the track promoted also didn't help either, and the track had incredibly quick S's, which led into a hard braking point for a hairpin. The track overall had various high-speed areas, which presented various challenges for drivers and tests of driver safety. Eventually, in November of the same year, the first sports car race would be held. The classic drivers of Ken Miles, Carroll Shelby, and Maston Gregory took the track, but most turned down possibly the best ride for the race, a 4.9-liter Ferrari. The car overall drove horrible, but due to the high-speed nature of the track, it could simply outpower every other car. But no one would dare drive such a dangerous machine, especially after the opening weekend where we already saw a fatality. But a young man named Dan Gurney saw the opportunity, and he took it. He would dominate the race, and beat all the drivers who had turned down the dance of death that was that 4.9-liter Ferrari. This would eventually lead to Gurney getting an opportunity with Ferrari to race in the following year's 24 Hours of Le Mans. 1958 would also be the first year the NASCAR Cup Series would host a race at Riverside, running 500 miles of the road course. The race took well over 6 hours and an average speed of under 80 miles an hour. Eddie Gray in a 57 Ford would win over Lloyd Dane. It was Gray's first Cup victory, and it marked the only time Cup would race at the track until 1961. Up to that race in 1958, NASCAR had been bouncing around to many random road courses, trying to find one that fit. They tried Road America, but only ran one official race there. They tried Willow Springs Speedway in Lancaster, but that only lasted a season as well. Watkins Glen was also tried, but the primitive track was abandoned after a few seasons. 1959 saw the first time not a single road course was on the schedule. The beach course was officially scrapped for Daytona Speedway, and all the other experiments had failed. However, what restored Riverside's credibility was in 1960, it hosted, for the first and only time, the United States Grand Prix. Sterling Moss and Inez Ireland claimed first and second in Lotuses. After 2 seasons away from the track, NASCAR decided to give the California track another shot. Lloyd Dane claimed redemption and won in 61. Ironically, whilst Gray's win in 58 was his first career victory, Dane's in 61 would become his last career victory. This time around, the race was only 100 miles and lasted about 73 minutes. Not many of the big-name NASCAR drivers even thought about going out to the West Coast. The race was run in May, the week before the Coca-Cola 600. The track was absent from the schedule again in 1962, but in 63 it returned as a 500-mile race, this time in January. The early off-season scheduling provided a plethora of drivers to participate. Dan Gurney ran the Holman Moody 28, A.J. Foyt drove the O2 for Ray Nichols, and the 1952 Indy 500 winner Troy Ruttman ran the event as well. On top of those big names, you could add in practically every NASCAR regular. Dan Gurney would pulverize the field that day, with Foyt and Ruttman behind him. The race took just under 6 hours, and attendance reached well over 50,000 people. To put that in perspective, that year's Daytona 500 had roughly only 20,000 more. This gave NASCAR its first big spark in terms of West Coast popularity. It also gave Riverside a November date for 1963, where Darrell Duringer won. The next 3 years they would race there once a year, usually on the third Sunday of January. Dan Gurney won all of them. Eventually in 1967 his streak was halted though by Pernelli Jones. But Gurney came back in 1968 and won again. During this stretch of time, the 1965 race became one of the most noteworthy races, due to A.J. Foyt nearly being killed in a horrific crash at the track. Foyt was actually pronounced dead at the track, but somehow he pulled through the accident. The crash was caused by brake failure, and Foyt was lucky to avoid the growing list of fatalities at the track. It was the year prior that the two-time reigning champion Joe Weatherly was killed there, after slamming the wall driver's side first. The year after that, Ken Miles would be killed there, with Billy Foster following him in 1967. And from 1960 to 1968, at least one driver was killed there every year. It was the horrific price of the death-defying speeds that could be achieved there. Eventually NASCAR started running the West Series with the Cup cars there, a tradition that would carry on for as long as Cup raced there. IndyCar had raced there on and off with Dan Gurney and Rick Mears, winning twice there each. And the IROC Series also ran there throughout its life, having various drivers win the event. By the turn of the 70s for Cup though, the track had officially become a staple of the schedule. The second date they ran there eventually was shortened to 400 miles, but the classic 500-mile event still defined the track. People like Foyt and Mark Donohue would win there, along with West driver Ray Elder. Eventually though, Cup regulars would take over the success, and normal faces like Yarborough, Petty, Allison, Pearson, and Waltrip all dominated there. Notable drivers like Tim Richmond would win there later on, along with Bill Elliott, Terry Labonte, and Ricky Rudd as well. The track was also featured in various classic movies like Grand Prix and TV shows like Knight Rider. By the late 80s though, the track was in peril. By 1988, former LA Rams linebacker Les Richter had found himself in possession of the track. He had managed it for nearly the track's entire lifespan, but due to financial peril from its owner, it caused the track to fall into possession of real estate development. The track sat in Riverside County, which at the time of when it was built, the population was roughly 170,000 people there. By the time of the late 80s, it had just eclipsed 1 million. Today, the county has a population of 2.4 million. A massive track sitting there was not adequate for the function of the county, and the bankruptcy pretty much sealed its fate. NASCAR had found 2 more road courses to take over its dates in case this did happen, and after Rusty Wallace won the 87-88 event there, the track shut down. The track had been named in its lifetime the house that Dan Gurney built, and now his house by 1992 was the Moreno Valley Mall. Housing developments were built over its front stretch, and nothing of the track remained. While sad, Dan Gurney, when asked about it, said he was glad the track was gone. And looking back, he was probably right. Riverside was a great track for its time, but it was also incredibly unsafe. It held insanely high speeds, and was built in a very poor place in terms of keeping it away from what eventually doomed it. Ironically, one of the last pieces of media that was filmed at the track and released was a comedy sketch for the classic show Super Dave. For many, this clip sits on YouTube for fans of the late comedian Bob Einstein, but for race fans, they see the last moments of a great track. The skit contains nearly an entire onboard lap of Super Dave driving around the track, breaking down a comedic drive-through of how it is to go around Riverside. Eventually, tracks like Watkins Glen and Sonoma were able to carry the Cup Series to its road course racing heights we see now. But whilst many fans see those 2 tracks as the original road courses of the schedule, both of them would have never made it to the series if it wasn't for Riverside, the original Cup Series road course.